there's a lot to discuss during Module 6. So the first thing I want to remind you of is that there's two big things that you're going to do before you're done with this unit. The first one is you're going to take the midterm. This is 75 questions, multiple choice, and you're also going to be emailed a set of essay questions. So you need to set up a time with me that I can email those to you. And then once you get them, you have an hour to respond to them and send back your response. Also, by the end of this module, you're going to turn in a research paper. Hopefully this is something you've been working on the whole time. And there's a separate video that goes through the details and criteria for that paper. The backdrop to this module, or the reading in this module, is the Enlightenment era. And this is similar to scholasticism because it references reason, logic, science, math, but it's a little different because it treats those things more as God instead of trying to bring those together with faith and religion. And I'm not saying that the contributions of the people in the Enlightenment didn't add to our knowledge of faith and religion. It's just it wasn't the focus of trying to bring the two together. Another thing you'll read about is the French Revolution, and you'll read a lot about it, but I want to highlight the fact that Napoleon tried to act like he was kind of working with the church, but he really had kind of a love-hate relationship with the church. He recognized that by making the people think that the church was kind of in cahoots with him, that it would benefit him. And so he made an agreement with the church, or a concordat, but he didn't really intend to live up to the terms of the agreement. And he even at one point put the Pope in prison. Another era that's discussed is called modernism, and in the book it kind of tells you that it's hard to define modernism because there's a lot of things that fall under kind of that umbrella. They kind of grouped a lot of advancements at that time under one umbrella. One thing dealt with the interpretation of scripture, and some people trying to incorporate more of a contextual or historical critical approach to that. Pope Pius IX is an important person in this reading or this chapter, and he's important for several reasons. One of which was that he wrote something called the Syllabus of Errors, and like Martin Luther's 95 Thesis, this listed 85 errors that he saw happening in the church. But instead of trying to reform and update the church, he wanted to basically blockade any kind of modernization. So it really criticized the modernity or the modernism movement. It also criticized things like free speech and the freedoms that some of the different countries were affording their people at the time. He also claimed that Catholicism was the only pathway to salvation. And so this piece of writing was not well received, and people didn't fully understand it, and it was pretty complicated. Another thing that he did is he called Vatican I, and although they didn't get to accomplish much at Vatican I because World War I broke out, one thing that they did define was a teaching that came from him about infallibility. So basically at Vatican I they said that the Pope has the ability to declare something infallible. This is not saying that everything the Pope says is infallible, but just that he has the right to declare something as such. And in fact, there's only been a couple of things that have been ever declared infallible. In order for something to be declared infallible, first of all, it has to be an issue that deals with faith or morals. It also has to be something that can be addressed to the universal church and not just addressed to a small group of people. And it also has to be defined as infallible in order for it to be infallible. And again, only a couple things have been declared infallible, and they've been teachings about Mary. In the U.S., the church, the Catholics in the U.S., when the United States was first developing, were not very well received. They really had a lot of discrimination toward them, and people really looked down on them. And this kind of changed with the Revolutionary War and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In the Revolutionary War, people were fighting side by side with each other, and in particular, there were a lot of Catholic nuns who were responsible for turning the tide on Catholics because they showed such compassion in helping nurse people back to health. Also, around this time is the Industrial Revolution, and there's a couple of voices in this era. The first was Karl Marx with the Communist Manifesto. And when he wrote this, he was pretty critical of the church. He saw the worker being violated in the warehouses and factories, and that their rights weren't being recognized and they were being mistreated. And he really blamed religion as part of this. In religion, we kind of talk about carrying our own cross and suffering like Jesus. And this led to a lot of people allowing themselves to be mistreated. And another thing he felt is that the government should step in and try to help people. And this kind of got translated into the government controlling everything. That's not exactly what Marx said, but that's how they translated it. And another voice was Pope Leo XIII in response to that, who wrote an encyclical that was called Rerum Novarum. This is a very important encyclical. It was the first of its kind. It addressed social issues. And in the encyclical, it criticized both communism and capitalism. And it also fought for the rights of the worker and for a fair wage and for good working conditions and for the development of unions. And so he also had a lot to say about the mistreatment of workers in the Industrial Revolution. In the book, it will talk about some notable nuns that you should read about and some of the advances due to missionary work. In the early stages of missionary work, missionaries were kind of dangerous to the indigenous people. They brought with them some disease, and they really kind of imposed their beliefs on these people in sometimes violent ways. But eventually, missionary work really did help spread Christianity, and in a good, positive way, where they really started to respect the culture and their traditions and try to adapt church to those culture and traditions, try to bring forth some natural leadership so that indigenous people can lead their own kind of churches or dioceses. During World War I, the church tried to take a neutral stance under Pope Benedict XV, and this was criticized quite a bit because people on both sides of World War I wanted the church to side with them. And I'm sure for the Pope it was a pretty difficult position to be in. A lot of fascist leaders started to form after World War I, and one of those was Hitler. And you all know that. And as far as the church during this time, Hitler, like Napoleon, tried to form an agreement with the church. And the church was criticized for coming to some sort of agreement with him. But at the time, the clergy who were in Germany were really being oppressed, and they didn't have real access even to communication with the church. So when this agreement was formed, the church was trying to give them some rights. But there were some things that happened where the church showed their disagreement with the Nazis. And one of those was with Pope Pius XI. He wrote a document called Mit Brennender Sorge. And this was kind of secretly passed out and read on Palm Sunday in all the Catholic churches. And it was very critical of the Nazis and Hitler. There were a lot of other people who showed a lot of resistance to Hitler, a lot of Catholic people. And I think the book goes into some discussion of these people. One person in particular I wanted to discuss was Angelo Roncalli, who was a bishop at the time. And he forged a lot of baptismal certificates so that if there were Jewish people, it looked like they were Catholic and therefore they wouldn't be oppressed. And Angelo Roncalli went on to become Pope John the 23rd, who's pretty important in history. After World War II, there were a lot of moral issues to address because there were a lot of advances in weaponry, and there were still a lot of dictatorships. And of course, this caused a lot of issues for people and their freedoms. Pope John the 23rd, again, who was Angelo Roncalli, he was selected after a pope died, and he was selected because they couldn't come to terms with who should be the next pope. So they intentionally picked someone who was quite a bit older, thinking that he would be kind of this interim pope and he would keep the status quo. So he really surprised everyone when he called for Vatican II. And he did this. When he did this, he said he wanted to open the windows and let in some fresh air. And so a lot of changes came from Vatican II, and you're going to read about those in chapter 1 of the Rausch book. But I also wanted to mention the popes that happened since John the 23rd. So there was Pope Paul VI. After that, Pope John Paul I. Then he was only the Pope for a month. Then Pope John Paul II. Then we had Pope Benedict XVI. And now we have Pope Francis. And of course, Pope John Paul II was really well known. He was the Pope for about 30 years. And he did more traveling than any other Pope. And he also canonized more saints than most popes did. Of course, Pope Benedict XVI made headlines when he resigned, which rarely ever happens. And I think he did this for health reasons. He was a very theological pope, but maybe didn't connect as personally with the people. And Pope